On this week's What the Ship, it's the Portless in Seattle edition. I am your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to this week's episode. So, a lot going on, I'm not going to lie. Every time I think things are starting to settle back down in the realm of ocean shipping, we're seeing it all of a sudden ratchet back up. And in this case, we're looking at a disagreement between the ILWU, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, and the Pacific Maritime Association over their contract renegotiation. And the most recent example here has been what has been alleged is a shutdown of cargo movement in the port of Seattle. We're going to take a look at that along with some other stories that are going on this week that will impact you, those of you outside the shipping industry and those of you within the shipping industry. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment. Hit the button, subscribe to the channel so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this week's video. Before I jump into this week's stories, just a quick reminder, we did a lot this week on what's going on with shipping. So a lot of stories are out there. For Memorial Day, I did a review of the movie Action in the North Atlantic. Great 1943 movie starring Humphrey Bogart about the Merchant Marine in World War II. Did a story on the disappearance of some World War II shipwrecks in Southeast Asia. And then a whole series of videos that really look at what is going on with the labor situation on the west coast of the United States, including an examination of issues of low water on the Panama Canal. And then just yesterday, I did an interview with Claude Berube, who is an author, naval officer, writer of both naval fiction and nonfiction. And of course, I'll have the link over to the show so you can go ahead and grab any of these videos if you like. All right, let's go ahead and jump into story number one. All right, so story number one deals with the issue on the West Coast, and this is the ongoing negotiation between the ILWU and the PMA. I'm going to talk about a little bit more in the background in story two. But the lead story we want to talk about today is this one from Reuters over on G-Captain. Port of Seattle halts operations amidst ILWU-PMA clash. And Reuters goes in some detail here and talks about it. Now, what I want to do is get away from the news stories here and go right to the sources. And so that's what we're going to do here. So first thing here is this statement by the Pacific Maritime Association. And just to be clear, Pacific Maritime Association is the organization that represents the 29 ports on the U.S. West Coast, all the way from Seattle, Tacoma down to San Diego. And they are made up of, they have an executive board along with a president, a CEO, but they are made up, the membership, and I talked about this more in a previous video, made up of the shipping lines, the terminals, all the organizations that deal with the ports. They've conglomerated themselves into this association. And they work in turn with the ILWU, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, which has locals in different ports, for a contract negotiation. And their contract expired the end of June last year. Now, we've seen a lot of contention between these organizations in the past. Back in 2014, 2015, there was a slowdown in the ports where we saw ships back up. We'll talk about this in the next story. And way back in 2002, we actually saw the ports on the West Coast close for 10 days. This wasn't a strike by the ILWU. This is the PMA locking out the ILWU, actually locked down the ports. And what we're seeing right now is finger pointing between the two organizations. They have been in negotiations since May of last year. And what we're seeing right now, at least in the port of Seattle, is it really starting to come to head. So this is the statement put out by the PMA yesterday. Coordinated and disruptive actions by the ILWU has shut down cargo operations at the port of Seattle. On the second and third shift yesterday, now this came out on June 10th, work slowdowns directed by ILWU officials grounded operations at marine terminals to a halt, resulting in longshore workers being sent home. On the first shift today, on June 10th, ILWU refused to dispatch any longshore workers to container terminals. As a result, the Port of Seattle is currently shut down, leaving American exports sitting idle at the docks, also not getting foreign imports in, but they don't mention that. PMA will continue to provide updates on West Coast port operations, which are critical to our supply chain, account for roughly 12% of the nation's GDP. Okay, so the PMA is blaming the ILWU for this. That's their take on this story. Well, let's go to the ILWU story. Here's the ILWU statement also on June 10th from San Francisco, where they're meeting right now for this contract renegotiation. The ILWU remains committed to bargaining a contract that is fair and equitable and represents the hard-working contributions to its members toward the ongoing success of the multi-billion-dollar shipping industry. They're going to get that dig in there, by the way, and we'll talk about that in a minute. PMA continues using the media to leverage one-sided information in an attempt to influence the process. Quote, despite what you're hearing from the PMA, West Coast ports are open as we continue to work under our expired bargaining agreement. That's from the president of the ILWU, Willie Adams. The collective bargaining agreement that the ILWU and PMA are negotiating covers more than 22,000 longshore workers at 29 U.S. ports. The previous agreement expired on July 1st, 2022. All right. Both sides are blaming the other here on this. Now, I know from talking to members of the ILWU that the issue that's been going up on Seattle is this. Ships are up against the berth in Seattle. Typically, the PMA will hire gangs to work cranes to offload the vessels. And many of the ships that are in port now would get 2 to 3 gangs working 2 to 3 cranes. Well, that's not what's happening. We're hearing that they're only hiring one gang maybe to work it. And then when they don't get sufficient workers to come in to work that day, they're firing the gang. And so the question is, who's at fault here? Is it the ILWU for not providing enough workers? Is it the PMA for not hiring enough gangs to do this? Or is it a bit of both? We have these two statements from each side pointing their fingers at each other. What we don't have is the Port of Seattle or the Northwest Seaport Alliance saying anything about this. So the Port of Seattle and Tacoma are merged together in what's called the Northwest Seaport Alliance. This is their webpage. Their most recent press release is May 17th of 2023. I pulled up their Twitter. I pulled up all the social media accounts. No comment from the Port of Seattle. No comment from Northwest Seaport Alliance on this. I should also mention there's no comment from the U.S. Department of Transportation, from the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, or from the Maritime Administration or the Maritime Administrator on this. So we're not hearing anything from the local, from the state, from the federal level at all. All we're hearing from is the PMA and the ILWU. So this is my note of caution to the media folks out there, because media has been flying back and forth here with issues. One of the ones that you've seen thrown out there is how much ILWU workers make. And now we're trying to villainize ILWU workers for making too much money. Well, again, if you're going to throw out their wages, be sure to throw out the PMA, the shipping company wages, the terminal workers' wages, so you can sit there and see how much it costs there. What I want you to do is see this. This is the schedule for the Port of Seattle that is posted by the Port of Seattle. This is their 10-day schedule, and in particular, I'm looking here at Terminal 18, where they're showing vessels down here, the Maersk Cairo, the Maersk Cardiff, the APL Le Havre, the SM Chengdu, there's another vessel in there, the Maersk Rubicon, OOCL Oakland, and the MSC Monterey. So this is at Monday. So as of Monday, we're supposed to see some vessels come off the berth, particularly the Maersk Cairo, the Maersk Cardiff, the MSC Monterey. The OOCL Chengdu is supposed to come on onto the berth at this time. Excuse me, it's the OOCL Oakland supposed to come on the berth, and the SM Chengdu is supposed to come off also. So if these movements don't take place, then we're seeing issues in the port of Seattle. And if you come over here to marine traffic, you'll see that. Oakland, CMA CGS Tigris, Maersk Rubicon are sitting here off on Anchorage waiting to come in. MSC Monterey, which is supposed to be off the berth, is sitting there. And then right here we see the Maersk Cairo, we see the APL Le Havre, and we see the Maersk Cardiff. Cardiff and the Cairo should be coming off tomorrow, Monday. If they don't come off the berth, then we're definitely seeing a slowdown in the port of Seattle. And what we'll start to see is vessels begin to back up. And when vessels start to back up, that's going to be the problem here, because this will have a domino effect. The minute you're not moving containers efficiently, containers start to pile up in the terminals, and drayage and railways, trucks will start backing up. And that's going to have a domino effect on the U.S. West Coast that we need to be aware of. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 2, which delves a little bit deeper into the story. All right, story number 2. Let's delve into the impact that this is having. We looked at the Port of Seattle. Let's look at the larger West Coast image. So this story over at CNBC, this is by Lorianne LaRocca, who also contributes to FreightWaves. $5.2 billion in cargo stuck off West Coast ports in truck and container bottlenecks. All right, so we're seeing a couple of main points that she's making right here, and I want to just highlight some of them. Slow and go West Coast port workforce conditions stemming from difficulties in labor contract talks. Already knew about that. Truck times in and out of the gate for container pickup at ports of LA and Long Beach are up, meaning that it's getting slower to rotate the trucks through. This is the drayage. And understand, you need rail and trucks to get everything out of the container terminals. Number of containers waiting off port limits for the Port of Los Angeles is more than double last week's level. Okay, not critical yet, but important to know. And then the threat of more ocean trade being diverted to East Coast and Gulf Coast ports is complicated by the Panama Canal. This is what we talked about in that video about low water. All right. Lorianne kind of summarizes this. And again, I'll have the link to all these stories. So if you want to delve a little bit deeper in here, you can. And I'm going to run you through a series of stories here. So number one, a lot of organizations are calling upon the federal government to intervene. So this story by Mike Schuller, U.S. Chamber of Commerce calls for mediator in West Coast port labor negotiations. You're seeing the ILWU-PMA point fingers at each other. So there's a lot of arguments to get a neutral party, if you can call it a neutral party, in there. Not really sure what they can do besides providing some information about it. And this is being called a lot. What they don't want to see is a lockout where the PMA prevents the ILWU from coming to work, or the ILWU strikes, in other words, doesn't show up for work. And again, we've seen this happen before. San Pedro ports prepare to manage ship traffic as labor disrupts cargo. We're starting to see the arrival of ships begin to pile up off the port. So I showed you Seattle just a while ago with some of those vessels off there. There's a big concern that we see a repeat of what we saw, not so much in 2020 to 2022 with the supply chain crisis. That's that blue line there. But what they're concerned about is what happened back in 2015, in January of 2015 to April of 2015, where we saw backlogs take place. This is during a port slowdown. This is when the ILWU and the PMA had that issue where they basically initiated a port slowdown. Basically, they slowed down the tempo of operations. There wasn't a shutdown or shutout. There wasn't a strike. If you want the shutout, you got to go back to 2002. That's when the PMA shut out the ILWU for 10 days and stopped everything movement. But understand, the difference between 2002 and 2015, number one, is volume. The volume is a heck of a lot more than it was in 2015. It is a buttload more than it was in 2002. But also understand there are alternatives. A whole video talks about this, those alternatives going through the Panama Canal, but you have the issue of low water in the canal. You can route through the Suez Canal to Europe. That's a little bit more expensive, but you also have to pay more for the toll going through the Suez Canal, but that is available. So there's a lot of alternatives out there that are happening. Same time you see this, stories about the amount of trade that's coming through. Retailers, falling U.S. container imports are at odds with consumer spending growth. So the amount that people are spending isn't matching up with container imports. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there is a lot of stuff piled up in warehouses that are sitting here because of the massive flux that came over, and the buying habits of people are again changing. And when buying habits change, it takes 2 months to 6 months for the supply chain to catch up with that. And that is playing out in a variety of stories where the U.S. container import level is tracking at 2019 numbers. We're not at 2020, 2021, or 2022, but those numbers were skewed because of COVID and because of the change in buying patterns. And if you look at what's happening, there's a whole series of reasons for this. So Henry Byers over at FreightWaves talks about this bullwhip effect, cracking U.S. import peak season again. And I want to show you a couple of charts that came from Henry Byers' stories at FreightWaves and from Greg Miller's. So this is from Descartes. Descartes tracks U.S. container import volumes. And what you see here, the orange line represents 2023. The red line was 2020. The blue line was 2019. And we seem to be tracking on 2019 pretty good. That seems to be the model we're following right there. Well, it looks like we're going to set to peak right around July, which is, coming into third quarter, just before the holiday season. It takes about 3-4 months for goods to get here beforehand, to get out into warehouses and get out to distribution sites. We are nowhere near the peak levels of 2021, 2022. If you look at the way the global port tracker is measuring this, it seems to be following right along with the 2018, 2019 numbers. The problem is Freightways, which has a system called Sonar, they're tracking loaded import TEUs at the point of embarkation. In other words, where you load them. And that's giving a kind of an idea of what's going to go on the ship. So they're not waiting for the cargo to arrive in the U.S. They're looking at the cargo being loaded in ports overseas at or at embarkation points. And while 2023 is tracking right there with 2019, by July, what you're seeing here is the forecasted number of TEUs coming is going to decrease either at a 10% level or even worse at a 20% level. And that represents a substantial drop. Now, these are predicted. These are, forecasts, excuse me. We don't know if this is going to happen or not. We shall have to wait and see for that. At the same time, these other issues are happening in the background. Number one, you've got the carriers shifting more cargo and more capacity onto more profitable routes. This story by Lodestar was great. It looked at the MSC, the Mediterranean Shipping Company's fleet, and really determined where they were, how they're pulling vessels off the Trans-Pacific route and shifting them over to other routes. Great, really quantitative data here in this story to look at. And then, of course, you have this story by Greg Miller, which kind of summarizes all those issues we talked about. And finally, tankers face a stuffy situation outside LA as U.S. port woes continue. We've been talking about containers, but understand the 29 ports we're talking about on the West Coast isn't just containers. It is bulk, it is grain, it is oil, it is vehicles, it's cars. And if we have slowdowns in the port, this could mean that car imports, car exports are slowed down, the movement of bulk commodities are slowed down, and including the movement of oil, gasoline, diesel is slowed down. So this has ramifications across the whole spectrum. Oh, and I should also mention, too, cruise lines need the ILWU to load bags and all that going in. So this could impact the cruise industry, too. So this can impact a myriad of ocean shipping. All right, let's go ahead and jump to story number 3. Story number 3 deals with the offshore wind industry. So one of the biggest growing areas in the U.S. shipping industry right now is wind and the development of offshore wind. Now, this is a big fight because of an issue called the Jones Act, which is the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, specifically Section 27, which requires that moving cargo to and from U.S. ports requires a U.S. ship, not just U.S. ship, but U.S. built, U.S. flagged, U.S. crewed, and U.S. owned. And what we're seeing right here now is Vineyard wind marks steel in the water at nation's first big offshore wind farm. So this is taking place off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. They're putting in an 800 megawatt Vineyard wind project, which again will generate electricity for more than 400,000 homes and businesses on Martha's Vineyard, 15 miles off. And we're seeing the beginning of that installation in that area. Now, this is going to create a lot of issues because, again, to do this, you're going to need U.S. flag vessels. This is creating a big issue. There's a piece of legislation right now going through Congress that would mandate if you use foreign vessels, for example, then those foreign vessels have to have crews from the flags that they're flying. So if you have a Panamanian or a Marshall Island registered vessel, you would have to have crews from those nations on board. That's not going to happen because there's almost no Panamanians, no Liberians, no Marshall Islanders on board here. But this area is one of the most important to look at. So there's a lot of contention here about, the use of U.S. vessels. We're seeing new vessels being built right now down on the Gulf Coast for this trade. Understand, everyone is involved in wind trade right now. Wind is one of the biggest industries out there. And so getting a wind vessel, whether U.S. or foreign, is going to be really expensive because of the demand. Demand is through the roof for these vessels and for the crews that are experienced in doing this. So whether they come from foreign vessels and foreign crews or U.S. ships and U.S. personnel, it's going to be tough getting them no matter what. And there's a lot of argument to invest in this aspect of the industry for the United States. The U.S. didn't do this in the offshore oil industry. In other words, we allowed foreign ships and foreign rigs to come into U.S. waters and did it. Deepwater Horizon, the classic example of that. That wasn't a U.S. rig. It was in Marshall Islands. And so one of the things that a lot of advocates are advocating is this is a great moment for the U.S. to get its foot back into the maritime domain, particularly in this area. Offshore wind vessels are large vessels. These aren't tiny vessels. You need big vessels to do this. And so a big push to get the U.S. back into this sector. All right, let's go ahead and jump to story number 4. Story number 4 flew under the radar of many people, and I think it's a really important story that's not getting the attention it deserves. Mike Schuller did this write-up over at G-Captain. Ship officer shortage worsening, Drury says. There is a hard-pressed element here to get ships officers. The global shipping industry's severe shortage of ship officers has reached its worst on record and shows signs of abating, according to Drury's latest Manning Annual Review and Forecast report. The report highlights a widening officer availability gap in 2023, reaching a deficit of approximately 9% of the global pool of officers. This marks a significant increase from the previous year's 5% shortfall and represents the highest level recorded in the 17 years since Drury began analyzing the seafarers market. This is the chart that they provided, and you'll see right here the shortfall in terms of percent. You go back down to 2019, the shortfall was less than 1%. I mean, it was really infinitesimal. But since 2019 to 2023, it has jumped. We're up at 9%. And the reason of this is very simple. COVID screwed the ocean mariner. Let's be clear about that. When COVID hit and everybody had to go into lockdown and sit at home and work from home, that was not the case of many in the maritime industry. This is the big issue the ILWU is making with the PMA right now. They're arguing that they were moving cargo throughout COVID and they didn't get a pay raise during COVID, and now they want their pay raise backdated to that, and they want a pay raise while they were making record profits. For mariners, it was worse, because mariners couldn't get off vessels because of COVID lockdowns, because of the impossibility of air travel. Many mariners were stuck on board vessels. Now, understand, a U.S. mariner in the deep ocean usually will work about one-on-one, usually about 60 to 90 days on, 60 to 90 days off. And that's a pretty normal amount. And before you sit there and say, wow, you get half a year off, sit down for a minute and calculate what a 40-hour work week is for a normal person, and realize how much time you actually work versus the scope of the year. Remember, mariners don't go home at night. They're stuck on the ship. So, they spend, half their time. It's even worse if you're with an organization like Military Sea Lift Command, where it's 10 to 11 months you're at sea. And for foreign mariners, it's very similar. Foreign mariners, by law, cannot operate more than 11 months at sea. There were waivers passed to extend them out past that. And for many mariners, they were stuck on ships. The worst part was their reliefs couldn't get out to the ships, and they didn't have jobs, and they weren't getting paid. And so they sought different work. And so COVID has had a big impact on this. Other issues that had impact on this, the standard of living on ships. A lot of ships don't have, for example, internet connections where you can get Wi-Fi and have the normal connections you have when you're ashore. The pay, the minimum pay for a mariner today is $23 a day, which is great for some areas of the world, but in other areas where you see the economy lifting up, it's not so great. Other issues, the war in Russia-Ukraine. 14% of the world's mariners come from Russia and Ukraine. And now you've basically lost them because if those mariners return home, they're stuck at home because of the war. And other mariners, the big five where you get mariners from are Philippines, China, India, Indonesia, and Russia. And many of those areas are seeing, increases in standard of living, and therefore, shipping isn't really appealing. A lot of people don't want to go away and work a job and be away and disconnected for that long period of time. And so we're seeing mariners suffer as a result of that. And what that means for the world is that we're getting short on the officers to crew these vessels, which could impact vessel schedules and the ability to sail vessels. It could also mean that you start recruiting officers from new places that don't have as much experience, and then we could see more accidents on the high seas. All right, let's look at our last story for this week. Story number 5 involves Italian Marines. Yes, Marines of the San Marco Battalion, my paisans. boarded a Turkish roll-on, roll-off ship to apprehend 15 stowaways. This is actually the members of the San Marco battalion fast roping down to the vessel. The vessel, the Galata Seaways, was en route to France when on board the crew noticed stowaways on board through some video cameras. The ship locked itself down and was able to secure the bridge, the engine compartments, and call for help. The Italian authorities dispatched out Italian Marines to board the vessel. And the stowaways on board were apprehended. Now, these stowaways, they're not exactly clear exactly how they got on board, but there was a big danger that they were going to endanger the crew and potentially take over the vessels. The Turkish account of the event is that the crew saw two of the stowaways attempting to enter the lock engine room. When they could not enter the area, the cameras showed them rejoining other stowaways. They believed that these stowaways were carrying knives, and that's what netted the San Marco Brigade coming in. So the San Marco Brigade boarded the vessel in approximately 6 hours after the first report, and with the vessel in Naples Bay, an Italian team boarded the ship from one helicopter while a second stood by to provide additional support. The heavily armed team searched the vessel, reporting that the stowaways had gone into hiding. Teams were also aboard the vessel to help locate the stowaways using dogs. A total of 15 people were discovered aboard, including 13 males and 2 females. The media has reported 9 of them from Iraq, 4 from Syria, 1 from Iran, with 1 unknown. Some reports are saying these people are from Afghanistan. It's not exactly clear, but what is clear, they were trying to get away and get to someplace else. So really hats off to the Italian San Marco Brigade for this operation, fast roping down onto the ship and clearing the vessel. You'll see this happen every now and then. Stowaways are a common feature in short distance sailing, particularly in the Mediterranean. You see it a lot in the Mediterranean, in Southeast Asia, in and around the Persian Gulf area. The other story of note I want to add is this one here. Mike Schuller, OSG tankers involved in back-to-back rescues at sea. This story highlights the crew of 2 overseas shipbuilding group tankers that came to the aid of 6 individuals in 2 separate at-sea rescues within 18 hours of each other. The overseas Santorini and the overseas Niski in the Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico. It says here, according to Sam Norton, the OSG president and chief executive officer, I've been involved indirectly or directly in 8 or 10 rescues at sea in over 40 years. I never imagined that in the course of 18 hours, we would have 2 rescues in quick succession. The human response to such developments is too often to diminish the significance of the latter or a series of events. Their occurrences somehow become normalized. This should be the wrong response. The preservation of individuals' life in a time of crisis is remarkable and extraordinary. And I will agree with that. Matter of fact, one of the things we saw is that the administrator of the Maritime Administration, Ann Phillips, awarded a medal to the crews of the vessels for these operations, for saving the lives of these people. Now, under international law, you have to save them. But again, it still doesn't diminish the fact of the rescue and the sometimes the danger it takes to lower boats, go in there and save people and get them on board. So really hats off to the San Marco Brigade for boarding the Turkish vessel and freeing that crew. And then same thing for the 2 crews on board the OSG tankers. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. A lot going on here, I know, but it's global shipping, people. You have to love it. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a thumbs up, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You can hit the super thanks button down below, which will allow you to contribute directly to the page, or head on over to Patreon and become a patron of the page. You become a monthly, yearly subscriber, one-time subscriber, whatever you like. Any support is appreciated. Had a big week here. Lots of videos came out. It takes a lot of time to do this, to put this together. I'm a one-person show here, as most of you know, except when the dogs are helping me, but they're not even here today. So until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.